So let's talk about closing costs.
Closing costs. So we had one of our great mortgage lenders here in the other day doing some training, teaching, and just going over closing costs again for all of us, just to make sure we're all up to speed. But this segment, it's just like, what are closing costs? So, Asel, you have a whole bunch of questions for us.
Well, Asel was
Let's see how we can
doing
do.
home loans for her first couple of years out of college. And so we're like, go ahead, let's you lead us.
I'll ask the questions now.
Okay.
So who pays the closing costs? Buyers, sellers, both?
Okay, so this is very specific to our location, right? In Santa Fe, it's different. In Kentucky, it's different. In Texas, it's different. In Las Cruces, it's different. So who pays closing costs? Both parties pay closing costs when you're buying and selling homes. The seller has some closing costs and the buyer has some closing costs. And some of them could be paid by either party depending on local custom.
Got it.
Would that also depend on whether it's a buyer or seller market too?
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, for sure. Sometimes when working with buyers, we're negotiating for them to have the seller cover something that maybe typically had been a buyer fee. Yeah.
Do you have a general idea of how much buyer closing costs are or seller closing costs? Are they similar? Are they...
Well, it's the universal answer. It depends, but there's definitely some very specific things that a buyer has, right? So if a buyer's getting a mortgage, all those costs associated with getting that mortgage are going to be buyer costs. So that could be your underwriting fee, your mortgage application fee, your mortgage processing fee. What else?
Credit report, appraisal.
Origination fee, appraisal. So those type of things, anything associated with the loan or getting the mortgage is going to be a buyer closing cost.
And that's the buyer's responsibility?
And that would be the buyer's. Yes. I'm going to say yes with an asterisk, right?
Like you said, it depends.
It depends. Well, we'll get to that because there's ways that buyers can alleviate some of those costs, right? There's some strategies there. So overall, anywhere from 2 to 5%.
I would
really
never
depends.
give that. I would never give a percentage
Okay.
of how much it's going to cost because
That's fair.
it's so different for each person, right?
The
percentage
caveat to
of what, though?
Of the loan amount. Now, the caveat is if there's a mortgage. If you're one of the 25% of people, or not that much, let's see what it is, about 18% right now, people pay cash. Well, if you're paying cash, you don't have closing costs for a mortgage.
Right. There's very few closing costs. Some of the closing costs when you're paying cash are not always closing costs. It might be the cost to do your home inspection. It might be that you want a home warranty. It might be a pest inspection, things like that. And then your closing fees are very minimal, very minimal.
So what exactly is included with seller closing costs?
So typically, sellers' closing costs include the title company fees, most of them. Some of the title company fees are on the buyer for buyer's coverage, but the title owner's policy is on the seller side typically. And that's a fee that's where the title company is checking the history of the property and making sure they're conveying clear title, that there aren't any liens or judgments on the property. And that's usually on the seller side.
And they're issuing an insurance policy to the buyer.
And the buyer's lender, if there is a lender.
Right, that they will ensure that there's clear title and ownership is all in line.
So when you're writing a contract, where do these fees go? Because you have buyer's fees and seller's fees when you're...
Good question. So when we're writing a contract for a buyer, an offer to purchase a home, there's the New Mexico Standard Real Estate Commission forms have check boxes, and you check who's paying for what. And you can add an addendum. So maybe something you've got it on a buyer side or a seller side, but you actually want to get a credit maybe from the other party to cover something. We just put an addendum together.
So something we haven't talked about yet, and we need to, is commissions, real estate fees, the fees that are paid to a real estate professional to help either the buyer or the seller. And just right up front, there was a lot of news about this last year about who pays closing costs or who pays commissions. And again, I'm going to say it again, they're negotiable, right? The seller contracts with a realtor, a professional to help them sell the house, and they agree on what that fee is. A buyer goes into an agreement with a buyer broker and agrees on what that fee was going to be. Now, when the contract is written, there may be a negotiation on who's paying certain fees. If the buyer doesn't have enough money to cover their broker's fee, they may ask the seller to cover that cost, right? So there's a lot of back and forth. That's why when we talk about closing costs, we always have to say it depends, right?
Well, and you're choosing your words very carefully on commissions because we have to. But in reality, most buyer contracts are still asking the seller to pay the buyer broker commission.
Correct.
Still very common, right? The big change last year was that we couldn't put the actual amount the seller was offering the buyer broker into the multiple listing service.
Yeah. So
That was the big change.
There's just more negotiation involved, and there's more. Well, and honestly, there's more transparency. That was the big change in 2024 about who's paying for compensation and how it's being handled. That's the big change.
Okay, so back to a buyer.
Yes.
So at what point do closing costs need to be paid?
Wow,
Good
it's
question.
different for buyers than it is for sellers, right? So most of the seller costs come at the end at closing, right?
Yeah, there's very few situations where a seller may have to pay for. There's going to be. It could be a
septic.
It could be a septic
inspection.
inspection. It could be maybe the buyer has asked the seller to pay for a full home inspection. It may be the appraisal, but those things are rare. And we're going to get into moving fees around too, right? In a second. But
sellers also might have to have paid for some repairs,
correct.
right?
Correct.
Buyers, on the other hand, they do have some fees up front before they get to closing, right? So they have some earnest money typically that they've offered to have set at title that goes against their closing costs or towards their closing costs. But they might have to prepay for their appraisal.
Mm-hmm.
They might have to prepay for inspections, very common. They may have to prepay a lender fee or something. Sometimes there's like a lock fee.
Yeah.
What
yeah.
else?
Yeah. No, that could be it. Generally out of pocket for a buyer up until closing date are those things you mentioned: inspections, appraisal,
Right.
and that's about it. Yeah.
Yeah. And then at closing, at closing, it all comes together,
Correct.
right?
Correct.
So I think the term we hear a lot is cash to close, right? Is that something that lenders talk about?
Yeah, cash to close is the amount that you write your check for to purchase the home.
Yeah. So once everything's settled and you figure out, okay, how much your down payment is, how much your costs are the sellers contributing to your cost, your purchase cost? Are you financing some of your closing costs, which can happen?
Especially if it's a VA loan.
Yeah, it depends. Yeah, so yeah, but cash to close is the actual amount that you need to bring to the final closing date.
Which could be a check or it could be a wire transfer.
Correct.
Right. Yeah.
Can't be mattress money.
Nope.
No mattress money.
Can't bring in your pennies and drop them on the table.
Nope.
Mattress money is probably an inside lingo thing, right? Mattress money, the money you hide under your mattress.
Piggy bank.
Yeah,
Your piggy bank.
How can I reduce my closing costs
that is as a buyer.
as a buyer?
Okay, do you want to take that?
No, go for it.
Okay, so as a buyer, like we said, you could have closing costs which are separate from your down payment, but you can ask a seller to help contribute to your closing costs. So if you're a buyer and you're short on cash, let's say you have your 3.5% down for an FHA loan. Okay, that's your down payment. That's your equity that you're putting in the property. But you also have some closing costs, and let's say that equals 3% of the loan value or whatever. You could actually ask the seller to cover those costs as part of the final settlement. And so that is a negotiation you can have to help you as a buyer bring less money to close.
And
now the other thing, Go ahead, Tracy.
Well, and so that's a part of the initial offer. That's not like we're down the road, we're under contract, and now I'm going to ask the seller to cover these costs. That's a part of the whole offer process right up front. Because right up front, we're going to say, we're going to offer this price, but we want the buyer or the seller to contribute X towards buyer's closing costs, prepaids, things that the lender will allow, so that the seller can take that into consideration and say, okay, for this price, am I willing to have this much go to help the buyer to get this house?
And that's why you when you were talking to Joanna, who's one of our lenders here, you're talking about the trifecta between the buyer, the realtor, and the mortgage broker, working all of that out when you're writing the offer, so you know exactly how much those costs are actually going to be when you're actually preparing the offer. So.
Correct.
Structuring it.
Yeah, and every loan program type, the VA, the FHA, a USDA, conventional, they all have different amounts of what's allowed. So that whole trifecta is really important. I did look up the definition of trifecta after last week's podcast, and I was using it correctly and incorrectly, but correctly.
We'll take it. Let me ask this, Tracy. The other thing for down payment, we do have down payment and closing costs assistance programs in New Mexico.
Yep, we do. The Mortgage Finance Authority, I know they have a new name.
Housing New Mexico.
Housing New Mexico is one of the programs. There's more than just that. But yeah, if you qualify income-wise and credit score-wise and things, there are programs to help people get into homes. So it's a great option.
I just have one last question. At what point do you see the number, the closing cost numbers?
Oh,
Good point. You want to take that?
yeah, that's very much right at the end, unfortunately. It all comes together about the day before you sign your closing documents. So we get that final cash to close, clear to close, everything comes together right then.
However, let me just back that up. If you're a buyer, when you first make your loan application, you know this as a previous former lender, you have to get a disclosure on what the closing costs. It's an estimate, right?
It's called the loan estimate, the LE.
The LE, the loan estimate. And so that's where the buyer has a disclosure on what those costs could be. Right? And then if you're a seller, Tracy, we give them an estimate right up front.
We do at Venturi Realty Group. We put together an estimate, but we don't know yet what repairs might cost them along the way, but we can be very close on the closing costs for most items on a seller side.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But like I said, the final number isn't usually until the day before.
Yeah, very
Signing.
much right at the end. Yep.
Just like my
Okay.
question.
Yeah, yeah. Awesome.
So obviously there's a lot to this, and closing costs covers a large area, and it can mean a lot of different things. And not really mean a lot of different things, but it could be very different depending on the type of loan, depending on the buyer, depending on the seller, and maybe what the seller's willing to contribute, and on the buy side. But if you're a seller, it's a little more straightforward because you're going to have your, again, customary in New Mexico, typical customary, whatever you want to call it in New Mexico.
In Albuquerque.
In Albuquerque is that sellers pay for the buyer's title policy. I mean, that's not set in stone, as can be negotiated, but for the most part, the seller pays all the title closing fees and the title insurance policy, and they pay their own brokerage commission for selling the home, and they may or may not pay the buyer broker's commission too. So that's on the seller side. But again, everything's negotiable for the most part, but people can set their own fees too.
Okay, so if you're thinking about buying, selling, just give us a call. We'd be happy to help you. Sit down, go through it, put together the numbers as best we can, and make sure we're working with good lenders if we're on the buy side that can really lead you correctly and get you into the best loan program for you. We're here and happy to help. Give us a ring, 448-8888 in the 505.
Awesome. Take care, everybody. Thanks for tuning in. Thanks for watching the video all the way to the end. We appreciate you. And please click subscribe. We'll keep you updated on what's going on with real estate in the Albuquerque area and New Mexico, and of course, across the entire country. Have a great one.